Coach Vance here, Senior International Weightlifting Coach and Professor of Sport and Exercise Science, also fitness coach for Help for Men. So go to helpformen.com/Coach Vance for your first month free. So I did a little bit of video kind of showing that athletes in general don't worry too much about their diets. They try the best they can to meet their energy needs. They know they have to eat a certain amount of protein, but other than that, they kind of just uh, monitor their body weight and that sort of thing and their energy levels, and they don't put a lot of strictness on their diets, including Olympic weightlifters. And a lot of people who are really interested in diets, they'll use diet coaches, they'll use diet apps, and those tend to be geared towards regular fitness folks really trying to just get jacked or lean or that sort of thing. And a lot of times those are based off of a very high carbohydrate diet, low fat, kind of just the middle of the bell curve fitness type of attitude, and I don't think that is necessary. It's okay, but we're going to look at how much carbohydrates do Olympic weightlifters actually need. It's probably different than what a lot of people think. So let's get into that. So this is a common recommendation for bodybuilding. Stu Phillips and others, for example, a high carb diet, which is not really based on a substantial amount of scientific evidence. The reason stated is that higher fat consumption leads to coronary heart conditions, which might be a concern. And anecdotally, PED using bodybuilders often use growth hormone, which is more anabolic in a high insulin environment to raise IGF-1. So a high carb diet and adding insulin would create that environment, but a naturally trained person won't need that many carbohydrates to actually maximize muscle growth per se. On the other end of the spectrum, I've seen the attitude that Olympic lifting is just a short burst of ATP with long rests, so carbohydrates aren't even needed for performance. I haven't heard it from a good weightlifting coach with a PhD, but that is an old way of thinking that glycogen isn't directly supplied during the first 10 seconds of intense training. We now know that this actually is not true. So this study was done with Olympic lifters and power lifters with a very low training volume, 5 sets of squats and deadlifts, 70% max. This showed that glycogen is depleted from training much more than thought, including directly from both the fast and slow twitch muscle fibers, and that short workout literally depleted glycogen by 38%. So this is now known as glycogen shunting. You can see that the glycogen is in several areas within the muscle fibers themselves, and glycogen is moving rapidly to create ATP, even during intense exercise and muscle contraction. There is good argument that strength athletes need carbohydrates to perform their best and not just resting until their ATP is restored between sets. So then the question becomes, how many carbohydrates do you actually need? This comes from the Gatorade Science Institute. It's kind of in line with the NSCA and others that 4 to 7 grams per kilogram per day is the typical recommendation for strength training athletes. And we can see here that high carbohydrates, 10 grams per kilogram or more, doesn't create any more storage of total glycogen, period. So having a huge carbohydrate diet doesn't actually lead to any greater performance. And these lit reviews show that carbohydrate manipulations, basically changing from lower to higher or vice versa, doesn't really seem to have a noticeable impact on performance. But if you're doing 2-day workouts without glycogen repletion between that, you see a drop in the number of repetitions that can be performed adequately. And not eating carbohydrates after training doesn't prevent muscle protein synthesis, but it does elevate muscle protein breakdown, and higher levels of muscle damage are prolonged. So then it basically becomes just an issue of math. You want to make sure you have at least 40% of your glycogen. You don't need significantly more. You aren't an endurance athlete. If you consume 1.2 grams per kilogram within an hour of training, after training, that will have the quickest repletion due to GLUT4 transport. Minimum, you probably only need 3 grams per kilogram over a 24-hour period. More is okay though. But if you're doing high volume trainings like 2-a-days and that sort of thing, you can bump that up to 4 or 5. And if you are doing 2-a-day workouts, then having a 0.3 gram per kilogram carbohydrate consumption within 3 hours of your training will prevent the loss of time to exhaustion. So, based on what I've seen, kind of from the literature and, of course, anecdotal evidence, being in the sport for so long, is there's probably not a good benefit to being on a low carbohydrate diet, except for like, the last couple weeks or whatever, if you need to make weight, that sort of thing. But there's also probably no good evidence that you need to be on this ultra high carbohydrate diet that you see with endurance athletes or the kind of the bro science bodybuilding diets. I don't even think they need to be on such high carbohydrate diets necessarily for just muscle growth. But you can have a middle of the road diet is probably perfectly adequate. 3 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates. If it is a concern, you can bump that up to 4 or 5, or just wait to kind of see how you feel, how you perform. And of course, you can always use more calories and in the form of carbohydrates, perfectly fine if you're trying to, especially gain weight as well. But having, 30% of your calories come from fat or even 40% probably wouldn't be detrimental to performance from what I've seen. And the last video I even showed that, these Greek team in 1996 and all of those guys that were winning gold medals, 3 gold medals, that sort of thing, didn't have very high carbohydrate diets. They didn't even have the highest protein diets either, and they were still performing. So there's a lot that goes into performance, obviously, but I think having this high carbohydrate diet thing, specifically for strength athletes, is kind of a little bit overstated and overblown in its effectiveness.